Chapter 17. An Unholy Marriage. France, 1786. He wouldn't go. That was absolutely certain. She was 50 years younger than his father. There was absolutely no way he would attend their wedding. Thomas Alexandre was seething. When his nearly geriatric father had the audacity to ask him to be the best man at this farce of a wedding, Thomas was speechless. He had done everything possible not to ruffle his father's feathers since the Bastille, but this wedding was too much. He couldn't hold his tongue, not this time. On some level, he had always known his father never intended to bring his family to France. Now he was certain. Antoine David de la Pailletterie had moved on. He probably never loved Thomas' poor mother at all. For a full decade since arriving in Paris, Antoine had twisted around Thomas' questions like a serpent coiling around its prey. He had suffocated any hope for their reunion with delays, diversions, and hollow excuses. This woman, Marie Retou, was nothing but a gold-digging harlot. There was no other logical explanation. Antoine certainly wasn't the love of her life. He was a disgruntled old man obsessed with money and title who had grown cantankerous from the memory of his own immoral decisions, which weighed on his barely surviving conscience. In desperation, Thomas had tried to speak sense to her. He wanted to let her know exactly what type of man she was tying herself to. But her response stunned him. Apparently, his father had told her that Marie Sosette was dead. She died of dysentery back in 1772, a full 4 years before Thomas arrived in Paris. Thomas didn't even respond. He just walked out of the room, speechless. His mother's reduced station was one thing, but claiming she was dead was beyond despicable. However, this lie cleared the way for Antoine to remarry. The church had done little to help his mother, but at least it had preserved the sanctity of her marriage. His father could not remarry while she was still alive. So he killed her, on paper at least. Now, dressed in his finest gold-embroidered silk frock and waistcoat, Thomas Alexandre paced the streets of Paris in a frenzy. Despite the frigid February temperatures, he only barely noticed the bite of the wind against his wig and hat. The wedding would start in an hour. He had already walked to the church earlier, attempting to talk himself into playing the expected role, if only for self-preservation. But the scent of the roses in the beautifully decorated church made him sick. He didn't mean this metaphorically. He actually felt physically ill. All he could think about was his real family rotting under the chain and whip in Saint-Domingue forever. In his gut, Thomas knew that if he allowed his father to marry this hussy, he would be condemning his family to languish in slavery for the rest of their natural lives. Antoine's patience had worn thin in recent years, and his mind had begun to slip into senility. He was quick to anger and slow to forgive. So when Thomas voiced his disapproval of the engagement, his father had been blunt. If Thomas didn't show up at the wedding, he would no longer be the heir to the Pailletterie fortune. Thomas needed that money. He had become quite comfortable living the life of nobility. Without his inheritance, he would be squalid. He had tried to think of other ways to support himself, tinkering with the idea of a military commission, but a soldier's pay was a far cry from the wealth due his bloodline. As he walked around the exterior of the church, unwilling to enter, the image of his mother consumed his thoughts. As he painted her visage in his mind, a painful thought struck him. 10 years had passed since he'd last seen her. She probably looked quite different now. Her hair may be streaked with gray, wrinkles marking her face. Or more hauntingly, there could be lash marks etched on her back. The thought was unbearable, so instead he focused on her voice. He could still hear it in the letters she wrote him, each word shaped by the accent she'd never lost. Every misspelled word carried the cadence of her speech, and the phrases, though slightly unpolished, bore the strength and resilience of the woman he remembered. He had to save her. The responsibility had fallen to him, for his father would clearly never do it. To accomplish that, he needed money. He would do her no service if he was destitute. The only way to keep his inheritance was to go through with this farce of a wedding. He made up his mind. He would go, but he would not like it. It had nothing to do with his own selfish desire to protect his comfort. He needed the money to protect her. He would not commit crimes against his mother as his father did. Unless a terrible thought struck him. Was he doing the exact same thing? The church bells tolled, signaling the hour was near. His feet felt heavy as he trudged back toward the church doors. A lush carpet lined the entrance stairs. Antoine hadn't invited many guests, perhaps 30 in total. Antoine must have known how poorly society would view his second marriage to a commoner, especially with the stark age difference. He found his father near the front of the church, sitting in a pew. He looked exhausted, not like a man should look on his wedding day. He stared at his son with stern expectation. The priest beckoned Antoine to take his place at the altar. Thomas, however, knelt down in a pew, moved to kneel in prayer. He hoped he would find some answers in the quiet of a whispered Hail Mary. Hail Mary, full of grace, the Lord is with thee. Blessed art thou amongst women. The organ began to play a lively tune. And blessed is the fruit of thy womb, Jesus. The congregation began to rise. Thomas glanced over his shoulder, refusing to stand. He had to admit, the bride looked stunning. His father had spared no expense on her gown. It was cream and pink satin with heavy pleats forming an elegant train with silver embroidery. Lace cascaded from her sleeves. Her hair was piled high, powdered and adorned with pearls and a white plume. The dress was so wide she barely fit down the aisle. He turned back to his prayer, refusing to look at her any longer. Holy Mary, Mother of God, pray for us sinners. She was halfway down the aisle when he knew. He couldn't do it. His eyes darted around the church until he spotted a small side door behind the statue of Saint Genevieve. He rose from his prayer, genuflected, and made his way discreetly toward the door. With all eyes on the bride, he didn't think anyone would notice him. He was wrong. Thomas Alexandre, his father's voice boomed through the church, causing the organ to screech to a halt. Marie froze in the aisle, her face flushing under caked layers of powder. Thomas turned to see the entire congregation staring at him. I'm sorry, Father, he said resolutely. I can't be part of this. Get back here this instant, Antoine growled, his voice menacing. No, Thomas replied firmly. It's wrong. This wedding is against the will of God and the Virgin Mary. You're still married. Gasps rippled through the crowd. He is not, Marie cried desperately. She died years ago. You should know by now my father is a liar, Thomas faced her. My mother's name is Marie Sassette, and she's been living in poverty in Saint-Domingue for a decade. She isn't dead. He just abandoned her. Ungrateful! Antoine's voice was harsh and cold. If you take one more step, you are through. You will no longer be my heir. You will be nothing. You will have nothing. Not my name, not my fortune. I don't need your name or your money. Thomas' anger was rising. If you walk out now, you will never be my son again, Antoine threatened. Wouldn't you just love that? Isn't that what you've always wanted? To remove any connection to Saint-Domingue and people who look like me. Isn't it, Father? You're getting a new wife so you can make a new little white heir before your cold, empty heart finally gives out. Thomas was fuming as years of pent-up feelings poured out to a captive audience. Antoine's face was scarlet. You are an embarrassment." "No, you are the embarrassment," Thomas shot back. "And she's only pretending to love you for your money. I don't need your fortune or your name. They would only mark my place in hell alongside all the brothers Pietri. I am a Dumas, like my mother." With that, he turned to leave, but not before casting a scornful glance over his shoulder. "Enjoy your wedding." The heavy church doors slammed shut behind him, leaving silence in his wake. Now he'd done it. This was bad. Really, really bad. He ran through the streets, putting distance between himself and the church. His mind raced. Exhilaration, panic, and fury coursed through him. A part of him wanted to go back and run his father through with a sword right there in the church. But of course he wouldn't. Instead, he found himself outside the Accademia. Without hesitation, he climbed the fence and entered the courtyard, ready to spar against his own shadow if he had to. He had no sword, but it didn't matter. He practiced his moves, his feet delicately gliding and lunging against his invisible opponent. It didn't provide the salve he had hoped for. The anger inside burned hotter and hotter. He needed to hit something, preferably his father's face. He broke a branch from one of the trees lining the courtyard and struck the trunk with it. With precision, he attacked his stoic opponent, but the branch quickly gave way, splintering against the unyielding bark. Undeterred, he snapped off another, though this one proved even more fragile. When it broke too, frustration consumed him. He lunged at the tree, abandoning the pretense of fencing form, and pummeled the trunk with his fists. The bark bit into his knuckles, but the pain was an aphrodisiac against the tumult in his mind. He felt the warm blood run down his hands, staining the lace cuffs of his shirt. The sight of blood seeping into the fabric jolted him back to reality. What was he going to do now? Could he even go home? Everything he owned was in that house. He let out a scream of frustration. At least the Accademia was empty for the break. Only a maid watched silently from a second-story window. He slumped his body against the tree and slowly crumpled into the frost-tipped grass. His fists throbbed and his mind raced. A headache pulsed behind his eyes and nausea gripped his twisting stomach. He desperately wanted a drink, but apparently not enough to muster the strength to stand up. He felt as though an iron weight had been anchored to him, chaining him to the tree. He sat in the cold, vacillating between his few remaining options. Apologize? It was too late for that. A voice called from behind him. "Are you planning to sit there and freeze to death?" Startled, he turned. It was the maid from the window. "I'm sorry, madame," he said, trying to collect himself. "Come inside, monsieur. I'll warm you some tea." He hesitated, then nodded. His body protested as he pulled himself upright and followed her to the door. Inside the kitchen, the warmth of the fire stung his chilled skin. "What were you doing out in the cold, Monsieur Thomas?" she asked. "You know my name." He was surprised. "Every islander in this city knows who you are," she replied, handing him a steaming cup of tea. "You're from the islands?" he asked, intrigued, though he could have guessed from her accent. "Which one?" "The same as you, sir," she said. "Would you like sugar?" "No, thank you," he replied. "I'll eat it in cakes, but I prefer not to touch the stuff anymore. It brings back unpleasant memories." "I know the feeling," she said softly. "I grew up on a sugar plantation too, before they sold me away from my parents. I was just a child. Bounced me around for a little while until I followed the master to Paris." "I'm sorry," Thomas said, suddenly feeling guilty about his own privileged problems. Perhaps this was God's way of humbling him. "Why was you hitting that tree, sir?" she asked. "I fear it's going to sound rather selfish to admit," Thomas confessed. I'm sure it's more interesting than sweeping classrooms in the cold. I'm not allowed to light the fires outside the kitchen when the students are not present. Perhaps, he sighed. My father is getting married today to an awful woman who just wants his money, and I got mad, and because I could not abide by it, I believe I have lost my inheritance. She raised an eyebrow. Oh. So you are mad because she wants your father's money, but so do you. I suppose when you put it that way, he replied, embarrassed. It sounds rather like avarice now, doesn't it? But it is more than that. My mother lives in chains on Saint-Domingue, but she is still married to my father, even though he pretends otherwise. I'm sorry, she replied gently. No, please don't be. This is hardly your problem. I am sure you have your own challenges to deal with and don't need the petty ravings of some entitled noble. I'm just so desperately miserable about the whole affair. I apologize for inconveniencing you. He sipped the tea. She looked at him carefully. It is the infirmity of our nature always to believe ourselves much more unhappy than those who groan by our sides. Her wisdom and humility wasn't helping to abate Thomas' embarrassment. I have never known a life with money, she continued slowly. I got my freedom when I arrived here, but I have never had the wages to rid myself of the man who has been my master for nearly 30 years. So I don't know if I have a right to say anything, but what I can say is that I think I am happy, even without riches. Really? Thomas asked. I believe so. I have a husband and 3 beautiful babes. They are mine, and no one can take them from me. I have my freedom, though sometimes it doesn't feel like it. It isn't perfect, but I think it is as happy as I am allowed to be in this land. To me, that is enough. Thomas mulled over her words. I hadn't thought of it that way. Has your father's money ever made you truly happy? Because if it didn't before, I doubt it can grant you joy in the future. Or perhaps you must reevaluate whether happiness must be given, won, or earned. It's peculiar, he muttered. Sometimes I feel like I'm wearing an iron mask, blind and bound by my past. Yet the same past makes me so afraid of the future. She shrugged. I have no fancy education. I work my fingers to the bone in a school, but I cannot read. So forgive me if this sounds unsophisticated, but I believe that in this world, all men, women, and kings must live for the present. We can only live for the future for God. He looked at her softly. I think you're wiser than you give yourself credit for. She laughed lightly. You're too kind, monsieur. No, I mean it, he insisted. I went to school here. This school has one of the finest educations Paris can offer, and yet some of the boys here are dumber than rocks, no matter how well they can read. They really are, she said with a smirk. Yes, but I think the wisest woman I ever met, you remind me of her, actually, was the old lady that raised us back in Saint-Domingue. She had more wisdom than any scholar I have ever met. Could she read? The maid asked. No, he chuckled, but she was sharper than any of us. I regret how we treated her, my siblings and I. We called her an old frog. I wish I could take it back. We all have our regrets, she said. The question is, are you going to let today be one of them? I should return to my duties. Can you see yourself out? Thomas nodded. He had regained most of the feeling in his body, though his toes still tingled slightly. Thank you, truly, he said gratefully. As she turned to leave, he called after her. I didn't catch your name. Niama, she replied. Named after my mother. Thank you, Niyama, he said softly. Thomas sat for a moment longer, staring into the now empty cup. She was right. He knew that. Happiness wasn't something he could inherit or demand. But whether he had the strength to seek it out on his own terms, he wasn't sure. He looked up and braced himself for whatever came next. He knew what he had to do. But knowing the path wasn't the same as walking it.